Cool. We are live. What's going on, everyone? Another episode of Poppitt's Corner. And I got Mr. DJ Gunderson and Mr. Steve Rosen, who is just, I should say, it's been out for a few years at this point. But you have
Yes.
written many books from doing my research. And this is one of your latest ones, I believe. The title of the book is Tonechaser, which is, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it documents pretty much your relationship with Eddie Van Halen and yeah. So welcome guys to the program and let's get started. So
Yeah, thanks for having us,
Yeah,
Tanner.
man. Very cool.
Heck yeah, excited.
I think we need to tell everybody that we're now neighbors.
yes,
And so expect to hear a lot of me on Tanner's show and
love it. Got a newfound
promoting
friend.
everything. And when I go to the market and buy some milk, I'm telling Tanner about it. So
That's good.
You can go together now.
That's cool, man. Hey, more friends the better, dude.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
well, seriously, thanks guys again for coming on. But Steve, I want to just go right off the bat. It's kind of going to be like a yin yang, because I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book. I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I know DJ has,
I read it.
but where I'm going to fit in with this conversation is I would like to get just some backstory on you personally as a rock journalist, because
Sure.
just from doing research, you've been in the game a long time. So what made you decide to be just like a journalist in general, and maybe not even in the rock realm? Just why pick being a journalist as opposed to a musician or anything of that kind of nature?
well, that's a great first question. My first love has always been guitar playing. I was a guitar player from an early age. And yeah, man, my dream gig would have been playing rock and roll guitar in a band and touring and making records. Early on, I realized how difficult that was. I was a good guitar player, but I never thought I'd be a great guitar player. Look, I was looking at people like, which is probably not the right thing to do. I mean, I was listening to people like, back in the day, Robin Trower from, Procol Harum and Jeff Beck. And I'm thinking, well, I'm never going to be that good. I mean, I'll never even be a tenth as that good. So I thought, well, I love guitar players. I love to write. I love to read. And I thought, music journalism was a thing. So for me, it was always going to be about music. It was always going to, I wasn't going to be a news journalist or anything like that. So it just started out. I actually started writing for a high school newspaper, Culver City Centurion. I had like a little column, and I had like the little Woodstock logo, the dove on top of the guitar. I thought I was so hip, And I used to go to the clubs and review shows. So I'd send out letters, go, hi, I'm Steve Rosen, and I'm the music editor for the Culver City Centurion, and there's 1,700 students, and they want to all come to your club, and I want to write some reviews, and, I'll get you guys coverage. And they all said yes, So I had a letter from the Whiskey from Mario, who was the owner of the Whiskey. He says, yeah, man, whenever you want to come down, just show me the letter. So I was sing these unbelievable shows. This is like 71, the year I graduated high school. So, I saw like Beach Boys, I think Chicago I saw, and I was just doing reviews for the Centurion. They were publishing the reviews. After high school, I thought, I want to continue writing. I sent out more live reviews to all the magazines that were out at the time. Creem and Circus were around, and everybody rejected me. I got all the rejection letters, Rolling Stone. And I finally got a little live review. I remember the live review was T-Rex. And I also did a live review of West Bruce and Lang at the Hollywood Palladium. So this must be like late 72, early 73. And this little softcore newspaper called the LA Star printed those articles. And I call it softcore porn because you bought that newspaper so you turn to the back and look at the massage ads. You know, it wasn't like it was hardcore sex, but you know, nobody really cared about the music section at all. Anyway, so man, you get a couple things printed, you use that as a springboard. I started writing for the LA Free Press, which was a very hip kind of an underground newspaper at the time. You know, there was actually a Free Press bookstore up on Fairfax in the Jewish section of town, which was amazing to go to. They had all these amazing books, you know, Jack Kerouac, you know, and Incense and Blacklight posters. And, you know, it just kind of grew from there, started writing for a guitar player, then ultimately Creem and Circus, you know, and along the way, I was always playing guitar. I always had bands, and I was always trying to make that transition because I always thought I was a better guitar player than I was a journalist.
Interesting.
But I could never figure out how to freaking make any money or find any open doors as a guitar player, even though what was frustrating is that every day, man, I'm talking to the management of Aerosmith, and I'm there with the A&R guys, and I'm there with the publicist, you know, and all these people who you're supposed, you know, who you're supposed to be meeting. And I say, hey, I have a band, you know, and it almost worked backwards. Like, well, if this guy's such a good guitar player, why is he a journalist? You know, it's like those who can't teach. Well, you know, so it was just impossible for me to make that transition. So, you know, kept writing and had bands along the way, enjoyed some success later on. But yeah, so I saw the journalism thing as kind of connecting the two pieces.
Now, when you first started being a journalist, especially in high school, obviously you're not, I don't know what you've been taught at that specific point in your life, but how do you go about being a journalist at first? And obviously you've learned more along the way, but just when you were first starting, I mean, what were the points that you were looking for in a live show that you would write about, or the atmosphere? How do you describe the atmosphere of the club at first? You know, how do you go about just painting the atmosphere for the reader? And that seems like a lot of time and hard work and just thinking. So how would you go about doing that when you first started?
Yeah, man, that's another really good question. So when I was on the high school newspaper, I was in journalism. And, you know, they teach you the who, what, when, where, and why, and how to write the headlines. Man, I never got it. I never, I mean, I sort of understood it, but it's like, I think I really got more from, I mean, like I said, I was a really voracious reader. I was reading a lot of books, you know, not really music books, just, you know, my guys, you know, John Steinbeck books and, oh God, who was I reading back then? You know, reading some music magazines, but I mean, I don't know how I wrote those stories, you know? So I went and saw, my God, I used to go to the Troubadour. I mean, all the time. There was a club out in Pasadena, probably not far from where Ed lived, called the Ice House. And I used to see like Cheech and Chong, you know, way before they were big, and they were doing their routines, you know, and I just thought this stuff was unbelievable. And I don't know what it is I wrote. I mean, I actually still have copies of the newspapers. I'd have to go back and look. And answer to your question, I never considered myself a schooled journalist. You know, I mean, I read people like Barney Hoskins, who's an amazing guitar player, and he understands the cultural significance of the Eagles within the, you know, panorama of rock and roll bands. I don't think that way. I look at the Eagles and I think, well, you know, Joe Walsh was a good guitar player, and you know, they had some good vocals. I just never thought like that. I never considered myself a hardcore journalist. It was always, I guess, by the seat of my pants. And, you know, and I'll give you a real quick story. So out of high school, I went to UCLA for a year. I thought, okay, let me try to hone my English chops. So I went into, I don't know if it was called creative writing or writing 101, you know, but I went in there. And I also thought, I want to get on the Daily Bruin. You know, that was their in-house newspaper. And they had some amazing writers. I remember one, the music editor, Stan Berkowitz. I remember very clearly. And so I remember going up the offices and saying, hey, you know, I was on my high school newspaper. I'd love to write some stuff. They go, yeah, you know, what do you want to write? And I go, I'll write anything you want. So I used to write like reviews of like live, like stage shows, you know, live performances and stuff. So I was doing those, and I got a couple printed, and I was really proud of that stuff. I thought the writing was getting better. And I would go into class the next day, and the teacher, and I wish I could remember his name, and I reference him in the book, and I don't remember his name, but he's there, and he's got that issue, and I walk in, and he's kind of reading the issue, and he kind of looks over his paper, at me, and kind of, looks at me, and I'm thinking, oh, he's going to say, oh man, you got print published in the Daily Brew, man. That's cool. And he looks at me, and he doesn't say a word, just kind of gives me a stink eye, and that was the way it went. I hated this guy. I didn't learn anything. I remember he took me aside one time. He goes, man, and he really said this to me. He says, you really think you're a better writer than you are. I don't really think you're going to make it as a writer. So I thought, okay, I quit UCLA that year. I got an F in the class. I think it was incomplete. I don't even think I finished the year. And that's kind of when I really started hustling and trying to get things published and this and that, And fast forward, that was 73. So fast forward 83, 93, what is that, 27 years to the book. And okay, you're right. I didn't need to sit in there in a UCLA English class. Listen, part of me regrets not having those skills and not having more of a polished journalism background. But, you find that little niche, you find your voice. And I hate to be, like romantic about it. But you find that thing that you do that other music journalists don't do. And you pursue that. And that's what I did.
Do you think that that's what separated you as far as why you didn't get the breaks you did as a musician, but because you had, you were doing your own thing, I guess, writing wise, it gave you your own style, and that style was kind of missing in that specific field. I think that would play a part in this, like not getting the opportunities to be a musician, but getting these opportunities to be, it's still part of the business, but in the journalism field. I'm curious, what was the jump off point for you though, in after going to UCLA and basically flunking out or dropping out of the school? But who did you hook up with first? Maybe like a manager, or did you just start going to shows and then that was kind of your jump off point to?
Right, man. Great question. And I can tell you precisely who that was. And I write about her in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
You do. And she was the one that introduced you to Eddie.
She was actually a little later. So,
that was later. Okay.
Yeah. That was Michelle Meyer. Michelle's the girl who booked the whiskey, who introduced me to Eddie that night. Rewind 4 years. And this is probably early 73. And I can't remember how I even met these people. There was a company called Gibson and Stromberg. They were literally the first rock and roll publicity company. Now you have a ton of them. Rogers and Cowan, SRO. There's a lot of them. Back then, I don't think there couldn't have been more than a couple. There was Gibson and Stromberg, and they were basically down on Sunset Boulevard, about 5 minutes where I used to live, up in the Hollywood Hills, and just a stone's throw kind of east of the whiskey where I'd meet Ed. And I met, I remember how it happened. It's hard to remember exact details and chronology. So, I moved out of my parents' house when I was 21. I moved up to Laurel Canyon into this little 1-bedroom place. And I don't know how I found out about that. I knew I wanted to live in Laurel Canyon. Laurel Canyon, for those who don't know, was like the place where all the rock and roll guys were living. It was really close to the Strip. You could rent an entire house for $125. So people like the Eagles were hanging out up there. Joni Mitchell had a house there. Mama Cass, when she introduced Steve Stills to Graham Nash and Dave Crosby. Mm-hmm. Clapton would go and hang out when he was in town. The Mothers of Invention, Zappa, the Doors lived down the street. It was unbelievable, and for some reason I wanted to be part of that. So I found this one little place. It was literally one room, $75 a month. And then I found out that the place literally next door to me, I lived at 1905 Weepaw Way, 1909 Weepaw Way, was up for rent. And the person who was renting that was a girl named Lydia Woltag. Lydia worked at Gibson and Stromberg. So maybe I met her as a neighbor. Anyway, we became friends. Gibson and Stromberg took me under their wing. I mean, they were handling the Stones, Jeff Beck, Wild Turkey, which was Glenn Cornick's band, who was a bass player from Jethro Tull, Steely Dan, Black Kangaroo, who is Jorma Kaukonen's brothers band, Dr. Hook. They were handling everybody, and they opened their doors. They allowed me to interview everybody. John Cipollina from Quicksilver, who's one of my favorite guitar players, had a band then called Copperhead. So they just opened the doors for me. I had access to all these bands. They were making phone calls to magazines on my behalf. They called Guitar Player. They said, hi, Jim Crockett, the editor. We have Steve Rosen here. He's a new writer, and he's going to be interviewing Jeff Beck. Would you be interested in his story? And I'm there in the room when she's making this phone call.
Dang.
And me writing for Guitar Player is like, that's it, man. It's like, I don't need anything more in my life, because that was everything. You want to interject here?
No, I just was curious, just in terms of, did you save all the rejection letters?
I do. I have them all.
Are you going to make a book with just all your rejection letters?
Be nice to the guy, Tanner.
No.
No, I get it. No, man,
I'm
I
talking about he gets the job. It'd be a cool concept. He gets, he has the rejection letter, but he gets the job working at or whatever magazine and then he has a story for each. I think that would be.
Yeah.
Cool
No,
concept.
it's actually a good idea. Yeah, man, I have them from, Creem and Circus. I have one from Penthouse.
Oh, that's wild.
Guitar Player. It's funny. I remember the first thing I sent to Guitar Player was a live review, which was stupid, and I'll tell you why. So I get a letter back from Jim Crockett. This is before Lydia introduces me. He writes back, very nice. Oh, good piece, but we don't run live reviews. And I was like, you moron. It's like, get it together. So at that point in time, I realized, okay, Guitar Player doesn't run live reviews. Don't be an idiot and send more live reviews to them. Know the magazine, the format that you're sending to. So to make a long story short, Lydia Woltag. Without Lydia, I don't know, man. I keep writing, I hustling. Things would have taken a lot longer. They were everything to me. There was a girl there, Jacoby Atlas. She was the West Coast correspondent for Melody Maker. Being the West Coast correspondent for Melody Maker in like 74 to me was like, she was God. Melody Maker, oh my God. I mean, I love those, English newspapers. She gave me a car. She gave me her Triumph Herald. For anybody who knows anything about cars, and my brother does, my brother knew, but the Triumph Herald is like the ugliest car ever made, right? You have Spitfires and TR6s, all these beautiful Triumphs, This is this ugly kind of four-door that they tried to import over here. I think they sold like 8 cars, and I got one of them. But she gave me her car. That was a kind of community it was, Publicists wanted to help writers because they were writing about their bands, and bands back in the day, they needed press. And magazines were the only place they were going to get them, right? There's no internet. There's no podcast. There's no, radio was in its infancy still. So, yeah, man, it was just a different world. I was lucky to have come up during that time.
And what was your first actual paid article? How much do you actually remember how much you got paid for it?
I remember perfectly. It was at Los Angeles Free Press story I was telling you about. It was a live review of a concert down in San Diego, put on by their station there called KGB. And I think it was the Doobie Brothers. And I still, man, I have the ad from the show. I found it online somewhere. It was the Doobie Brothers. I don't know, 4 or 5 other bands. And again, Gibson Stromberg said, hey, listen, we're putting on this show. Go down there. They had a busload of journalists go down, So I wrote the review. And I think they had also contacted the the free press for me. Chris Van Ness, who's a pretty famous guy. I mean, Chris Van Ness, man, he had done a lot of interviews, you know, and I knew his name, and I thought, oh my God, my story's going to Chris Van Ness, you know. And so it was a weekly. So each week I'd check it, you know. This is the kind of a newspaper you'd find in like the vending machines. You put in a quarter and open it up, you know. So I remember going, you know, and I'd open and I looked at the music, and yeah. So it must have been 2 or 3 weeks later. And I remember I was at Bob's Big Boy restaurant in Culver City. And there was one of these little vending machines right outside, you know. So I thought, I'm going to go check, you know. So I don't know if I put in a quarter, or sometimes I used to bang on the thing and open it up, you know, poor journalist. Open it up, you know, and I'm looking, you know, and I look and I see, you know, KGB, you know, live show, you know, and at first it doesn't register, man. It's like, you know, that go, oh my God, you know, Steve Rosen. And I'm telling you, man, that moment, it's so clear. I took every issue, and, you know, and I really thought, if I never did another thing in my life with journalism, I feel like I'd done something. I got $20. I thought, I am a rich man, dude. I would have
That's
paid,
awesome.
I would have paid them $20.
Right.
And you know, there have been extraordinary moments subsequent to that, you know, and you know, my first cover in Guitar Player, again, which Lydia set up, Jeff Beck, you know, writing this book, writing my other books, you know, meeting my heroes. Those were remarkable moments, man. But that first one, you know, it's like a drug addict, man. It's never, you know, it's good after that, but it's never quite that high again, you know. But that was amazing. That feeling was just so amazing to me. You know, I felt like it was such an accomplishment. I just, you know.
Now, would you ever travel being a journalist? Would they fly you out to, I don't know, New York City or Europe or something? And when was that period for you? Because I would assume that would be like the next level of just, you know, you're doing the locals, you were doing the high school to the locals, and now you're being flown. I mean,
Yeah.
It seems like you have the same trajectory as a musician of doing these little things that get you to that next level. So when was that specific point?
Yeah, man. Yeah, no, back in the day, labels could not do enough for journalists. Man, there was so much swag. I had a collection of records because they wanted you to have the records. They wanted you to know about the artists. So I was on the mailing list for every label, you know, Capitol and MCA and Warner's and, you know, Elektra. And I mean, at the end of the day, I had about 8,000 or 9,000 records. I had a lot of records, you know, T-shirts and concert tickets and backstage passes. And yes, hey, Loggins and Messina are playing, and I can't remember the exact state, Idaho. You know, we're going to fly you out there, and you're going to interview the guys, and we'll fly you back. I thought, my God, are you kidding me?
You don't have to pay for it.
You don't have to pay for anything. Obviously, they're going to put you up in nice hotels.
They would pay him.
Yeah, look, I know.
Exactly.
That's the thing. That's cool.
It was like the most unbelievable thing. I thought this can't be real.
Now, what were they specifically looking? Just like, so a magazine would fly you out. What were they looking for? Would they give you notes as to like, please make sure to cover these aspects, or was it just, hey, go out there and do what you do?
You know, it's funny because it was sort of a tandem thing. The publicist would set it up, and yes, the magazine would want the story. Yeah, but ultimately the management would pay. I think all they ever expected was a positive story. You know, if I came back and I said, hey, you know, those guys really didn't sing too well that night and they didn't do their biggest hit, that probably wouldn't have made anybody happy. Mm-hmm. But the truth of it is, those bands were unbelievable back then. And even if I wasn't the biggest Loggins and Messina fan, you know, yeah, it was like this fairy tale, you know? So yeah, the reviews, the feature stories were 99% positive. If I ever said anything, it was, oh, you know, the drums could have been louder, or, you know, but yeah, man, I flew all around the country. I would ultimately go out, I was out with Deep Purple in 74. I saw a couple of shows for the Burn Tour. Richie Blackmore,
you got a Richie Blackmore story with Eddie. It's in the book where he meets his hero. It doesn't go all too great.
Doesn't work out quite like I'd imagined.
No, he goes, "Oh, oh, don't tell me, you play guitar, right?"
Richie said that to Ed.
Yeah, and it's Eddie's hero, right?
I mean, I can't imagine what that must have felt like. So went out with the Who for 2 days. When I was Sabbath in '74. Oh man, I'm missing so many. But yeah, man, they'd fly you around. They put you up in nice hotels. You have backstage passes. It was honestly the money was okay. Magazines, they didn't pay great, but if you're doing 4 or 5 stories, a month, and I lived way below my means. I was paying $125 for rent in a house. I mean, I was living like a king, man.
Now, in your specific career, what were some of the defining moments for you personally? So if you had to write, say, your own book or movie, what would be some of the key points where it was like, no, this defined who I am? I'm sure your first the article with the KGB would probably be in there, or how you got started in high school, being flown out maybe for the first time, or seeing whatever band. Can you give me just 5 or 6 that would really define who Steve Rosen, what Steve Rosen's career would actually be?
Yeah, man, that's good. That's a good question. The first guitar player cover in December '73, Jeff Beck. I ended up writing for Guitar Player for 7 years. In that 7-year span, out of a total, it was a monthly, so that's what, 84. Out of 84 issues, I wrote 16 cover stories. I mean, I was like the guy. They loved what I did. That's not to mention all the feature stories I did that weren't necessarily covers. So that was, that really, I made my bones with Guitar Player. They were the Bible back then. If you were a guitar player, you wanted to be in Guitar Player magazine. Guitar World was a little after them. I started actually writing for Guitar World in '84. I would look at that as sort of another stepping stone. In '77, I wrote a book on Jeff Beck. It's actually the first biography ever released on Jeff. It came out in Japan, in Japanese only. I was writing for a Japanese magazine called Player, really big Japanese magazine. And they said, "Hey, write a book on Jeff Beck." Jeff Beck was God in Japan. I mean, he was God. And so I wrote that book. That was the first of counting the Van Halen book, 8 books that I'd write. That was important. This journalist guy is now a book writer. My first story in Rolling Stone, man, '74. I heard that Paul Rodgers had a new band called Bad Company. I was a monster Free fan. I loved Free. When I heard that he had a new band, I heard, Mick Rouse was in it, and Boz Burrell from King Crimson, and Simon from Free. I go, this band is going to be huge. Never having heard them, I go, they're going to be huge. I was sent a test pressing, a white label copy is what it's called. The label is just white, and the actual cover is just all white. There's no graphics. There's nothing, artwork, just called a white label test pressing. I heard it and I go, oh my God, they're going to be huge. I had been, pitching things to Rolling Stone, and I kind of knew somebody over there, Judy Sims, who was like, she was an editor, and her office was just a few minutes from me up in Hollywood, and very nice. And no. And I pitched her this. I go, Judy, the band's going to be huge. I'm telling you. She goes, okay. Goes, we never run a story before we've heard it, but we trust you. So I remember going to the Continental Hyatt House, which is a famous Continental riot house, where all the bands stayed on the Sunset Strip. Right back in the day, all these English bands were coming over, and even the American bands. Hotels didn't want them because, they'd trash hotels, man. They'd, break TVs. But what the hotels fail to recognize is that the bands always pay for their damage. At the end of the day, they brought in other tourists. So the Continental Hyatt House actively, oh, I'm sorry, man.
You're good. Don't
pursued those people, So Bad Company was staying at the Hyatt House. I remember going up there, man. It was all 4 of them in the room. And they were just so cool. They were so nice, man. And they knew I was there from Rolling Stone. And this is 74, man. This is their first record. So a writer from Rolling Stone, even though it's my first story, I'm pretty hip, right? I'm pretty heavy now, you know. I have a little bit of juice being in a room with these remarkable guys, you know. And then the story came out, and I thought, oh my God, this is just the greatest. You know, so that was a huge stepping stone. Ultimately, I had 2 more stories in Rolling Stone, and they were both, you know, for me, big moments for me, you know.
Now, when you reach like a Rolling Stone, I'm curious if what their criteria was compared to Guitar Player, Guitar World. What were they specifically looking for? Because this is Rolling Stone. Back in the day, they were like the magazine.
Yeah.
Like literally the magazine for rock and roll. And I don't know if it was like Almost Famous. I don't have no idea because you know, it's one of my favorite movies, but I'm just generally curious of what was their criteria in the 70s? Because this is, again, back in the heyday. This is like they're on top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I realized all of that. And in terms of content, it was a completely different story than I would have written for Guitar Player. Guitar Player, it's like, Jeff, what kind of guitar did you use in the Yardbirds? And no, you were using Vox AC30s. You know, if I had run one line in my story with Rolling Stone like that, they would have gone, that's not what we want, you know. I suppose I probably was looking at some of the other stories in Rolling Stone. Look, man, I was intimidated. You know, now the door's open and I've got the interview, and it was a good interview. And now I've got to produce. It's like, you know, you go back to the question about, you know, I wish I had maybe some more journalism chops. But again, I just followed my nose, you know. So I thought, well, what does somebody want to know sitting there across the room from Paul Rodgers, who's arguably one of the best English singers ever, you know? So I remember he was wearing like a Cub Scout shirt, you know, like with badges, you know, like the Cub Scout, you know, and so I wrote about that, you know, and I wrote about just other guys kind of lounging around, you know, and I remember using the term media blitz. I thought, oh, that's pretty hip, you know, because there were billboards up, you know, and yeah, so I sent it in, you know, I'm thinking, oh God, please let them like it. Please don't let it be a rewrite. Please don't let them reject it, you know. And they printed it, man. I think they literally printed it word for word. So yeah, that was a big challenge. And I want to get back to your comment about Almost Famous. Cameron Crowe, I didn't know Cameron well. He used to come up to LA from San Diego. He was writing for a paper at the time called the San Diego Door. And I'd read some of Cameron's stuff, and he was a marvelous writer. You know, Cameron was the golden boy. And, you know, he was doing cover stories in Rolling Stone and was 16. You know, I remember his Allman Brothers story. I remember his first line was something about talking about Greg Allman, about the accent came up through Texas to Georgia. And I thought, oh my God, this is so good. You know, it was so good. It made me sick, you know, but, you know, not that I was ever even good enough to be in Cameron Crowe's shadow, but I've had other people mention I was Almost Famous accurate, you know, but look, hey, I get it. You know, look, man, I wish I had Cameron's chops.
It's the reason why I brought it up was because like that's really like the only movie as far as I'm concerned that like paints journalism's in like a great light.
Yeah.
And so I was just,
yeah,
you know,
man,
it's kind of
cool.
it's our only like point of reference.
I get it.
You know,
Yeah,
so
I know, man.
Now, was there a genre of music or a band or something? I mean, it's been so long. I'm sure you can give me something here, but was there ever a style of music that you were like kind of dreading writing about? Was it punk? Was it new wave? Was it, I mean, cause you probably had to have a plethora of, you know, a palette of, you know, taste in music. So was there ever that one genre or something where it was like, you were dreading having to write about it just to collect a check? Or
yeah, man, well, you hit on 2 of them. Punk, I never got. Look, I can understand the cultural thing of it, man, and the anger of it. I just, man, I just didn't like it at all. I don't think I ever really wrote about punk. Did an interview, they called Suburban Lawns, Sue Tissue. They were like this punk band. They were horrible. And I don't know why I did it.
Oh,
The story
gosh.
never even got printed, New wave, I wasn't a big fan, I certainly liked it more than punk. I mean, that kind of that, even that kind of that rootsy bluesy thing, I must have been pitched Bonnie Raitt. Bonnie Raitt, back in the day, I mean, she had an album a year out, man, on Warner's. And I was the kind of person where I would probably keep the album in my collection, although I wouldn't listen to it. But once I kept one album by the artist, I had to have the whole collection, man, as that OCD thing
That's
in
how it
me.
works.
But it's like, it was only later, yeah, man, that I thought, Bonnie Raitt, why didn't I interview Bonnie? It just didn't do anything for me. That bluesy, her thing. The country thing, I never liked that, man. Honestly, man, even the hair metal thing, typically the guitar players in those bands and even the music was pretty good, but it was the singers that usually bothered me a little bit. I mean, Winger was pretty good. Motley Crue, I never cared for, man. Dokken, George Lynch was an amazing guitar player.
Love Dokken.
Yeah, and I interviewed some of those guys back in the day, and it was cool. I remember doing a Motley Crue interview, and it was pretty strange. Like a couple of them would walk in, then one of them would walk out, then one of them walked in, and they were assholes, But Nikki Sixx was very, Nikki Sixx was very cool,
All right.
But yeah, man, that's a great question. Did I ever write for a paycheck? If I did, it was because it was sort of, you wash my back, I'll wash your back. So again, Gibson Stromberg, hey, we need you to interview Dr. Hook, at the cover of the Rolling Stone. I don't know if you remember that song. It was actually a pretty good song. I was never a fan of Dr. Hook. They said, hey, interview Dr. Hook. We'll let you interview Steely Dan. I go, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey,
Okay.
fair enough. That makes sense to me.
Now, were you using those particular, I wouldn't say just collecting a paycheck, but I would probably use that to my advantage as to, becoming a better writer in a place that like I'm not as comfortable. Because when you're in an uncomfortable kind of situation, you really learn your chops, I feel, even like doing an interview, doing whatever it is, if you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation where you don't know as much, you have to kind of fight to learn and to grow into your craft. So do you think that taught you, how to become a better writer, even though you didn't have the schooling that you wanted? Was that experience, how much did that teach you to become a better writer in your field?
Man, that's interesting. I was never a huge Steely Dan fan. Gibson Stromberg handled Steely Dan. I went and interviewed Walter and Donald. Gibson Stromberg had these little offices right on the Sunset Boulevard, right across the street from Tower, which is gone for many years now. And I remember going in there, and Donald was a little strange. Walter was a very nice guy. I wasn't a huge fan. This is probably the first or second record, so they were still kind of, they were playing the Santa Monica Civic. In answer to your question, I wrote that story. I'm trying to remember who I wrote it for, but I wrote, and I didn't realize this till later, I wrote what I thought was a really good story. Look, I am really very modest about what I do as a writer. I'm always comparing myself to these people and Cameron Crowe and, my God, Chuck Klosterman and these writers. It's like, so good. So there's a company called Rock's Back Pages. All these writers put their content up there, and if you're a podcast guy, and you want access to all these interviews. Literally, there's hundreds of writers, all the stories that were printed in Melody Maker and by Steve Rosen. It's just like a subscription. So they approached me, and I gave them a bunch of my stories, and one of them was a Steely Dan story. And so I put it up there, and so I had to go on their site for some reason. I'm looking through, and I saw a bunch of Steely Dan stories. I don't know what I was looking for, and I see this story, Steely Dan. I didn't know it was my story, and I'm reading it and go, wow, that's a pretty good story. And I honestly, man, I go and I look and I go, oh my God, that was a really good story. And answer to your question, yeah, man, I think I stretched myself to understand and write intelligently what Steely Dan was about, because obviously they're a very intelligent band. So yeah, and yeah, you try to expand on that and yeah, become a better writer.
Yeah, it probably made you more articulate, I think is the
Right.
correct lingo here with that. Now, when was the moment when it was kind of too much for you to write about? Like, was like when the death metal thing came in, were you writing for stuff on like extreme metal and things of that nature? Or were you, like this was the point where I had to kind of move on to something else in terms of writing, and maybe that plays in the part of why you chose, to take that next level and write books and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happened probably in the late 90s, 2000s. I mean, the magazine thing, even that early on in, over in America, in the US, man, it was drying up. So a lot of those magazines were now working entirely with staff people, right? So as a freelancer, you had a tough time getting into there. I mentioned Player early on, the Japanese magazine. I literally wrote for Player for 45 years. It was unbelievable. So I was writing for Player still. And Japan at that time, they were still, they still wanted rock stuff, but there weren't that many other magazines I was writing for. And so I turned to the online thing, and I started writing for a site called Ultimate Guitar. And man, I was interviewing all kinds of metal bands. I mean, I'm trying to think of who's. Oh my God! I mean, tons of tons of hardcore, metal bands, European bands. That growling vocal thing, which has never been my thing. But again, man, some of the guitar players in these bands were really good guitar players. Meshuggah, oh man, bands of that ilk. I mean, there were Lamb of God.
We were saying late 90s. What about like Chuck Schuldiner? Did you ever have any run-ins with him? Do you know who that is?
Yeah, I do.
Guitarist
from Death.
Which band?
Death.
I haven't.
Okay.
I haven't. But bands like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Ultimate Guitar, just so you're aware, DJ, was like almost a tabbing site. Like when I learned how to was learning my chops on guitar. Ultimate Guitar was like literally one of the only guitar tab websites. So that's how I learned how to play people's songs. Was through. So it's interesting that you worked for that magazine, and mainly now they do a lot of news stories. I don't know how when that transition actually happened for that site, because I knew it as a tabbing website for guitars. So what was your first book, and why did you decide to get into that specific field?
That first book was that bio on Jeff Beck. And really it happened because they approached me. I love Jeff Beck. I think Jeff Beck is the greatest guitar player who ever lived. That being said, I think Edward Van Halen is certainly in top 5. I think Ed was the most influential guitar player that ever lived, more so than Hendrix or Clapton. But I think Jeff Beck as a technician was the greatest ever. So when they said, hey, do you want to write a book on Jeff Beck? I said, oh my God, yes. So I started collecting interviews, but then I'd also interviewed a lot of people that Jeff had played with. the BBA, Beck, Boger, and Appice, Carmine Appice and Tim Bogert, and ultimately Stevie Wonder. Jeff played on a couple songs from Stevie Wonder. Max Middleton, who played keyboards on Jeff's first instrumental record, Blow by Blow, which is the greatest instrumental guitar record ever made. So that's how that happened. The next book that I wrote was
and what was their criteria? Was it they wanted an autobiography or a biography on the guy, or how did you approach it at first? Because this is your first time writing a book. It's like, what do I do?
I just followed my nose. I just put together all these interviews that I had with all these other cats that he played with. I had the interviews with Jeff. I knew they wanted guitar stuff. I mean, it's a musician's magazine. I reached out to some people. Seymour Duncan Pickups. Seymour was good friends with Jeff. He gave me these amazing photos and all the specs because he had Jeff's Esquire Ortelli, and he put some new pickups in. Anyway, he provided me with a bunch of photos. I kind of knew anything that I gave to Player they were going to dig. And it was a good book. And in fact, I've been thinking about revisiting the book. When this second edition, sorry, man,
You're good.
when's its way towards the end, I've been thinking about revisiting the Jeff Beck book. Look, there have been other books out on Jeff since then, of course, on some really good books. But I think that book I did in 77 is interesting because it was done in 77. And these interviews that I've done with these people, it's more of an era of them playing with Jeff and their memories of Jeff, and the 3 or 4 interviews I did with Jeff, again, I think the last one was for Guitar Shop in 88, 89. Anyway, think about that. The next book, if I can get my chronology correct, was...
Did he ever tell you what he thought of the book?
Oh my God. You want to hear the Jeff Beck story?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Well, so I now have the 2 greatest guitar players on the planet yelling and screaming at me. And so I interviewed Jeff in 75. Interview him the first time, Gibson Stromberg for Guitar Player, the cover. Interview him again in 75 for the BBA record. I'm sorry, the Blow by Blow record. As I said, which I think is the greatest guitar instrumental record I've ever heard. Interview him, and I think I brought up the idea of a book. And I think he might have hemmed and hawed a little bit, So I reached out to his manager. And his manager said, well, maybe let's see. Why don't you start working on it? Okay, great. So I start working on it, collecting these interviews. I'm working, I'm collecting, 2 years go by. I reach out to the manager again saying, look, I've collected these interviews, it would be amazing if Jeff would sit down and, I could interview him some more. I talked to him about guitars. I wanted to talk to him about his family. Very little was known about his family. This is 77, right? Nobody knew anything about Jeff Beck. And he had a sister. The sister introduced him to Jimmy Page, and there's a Yardbirds connection. All those things I wanted to talk to him about. And nothing was ever solidified. I never really heard back from them. And the player saying, hey, we'd like to get it done, this and that, And so I just went ahead and wrote the book, thinking, okay, write it, Jeff's not going to be involved. It's not an authorized biography. But I thought the book was really good, It was basically 150 pages of me saying how great the guy is. And these amazing, comments, again, from Stevie Wonder, sorry, man, and Max Middleton and, Stanley Clarke. John McLaughlin he played with, Mahavishnu Orchestra was a huge influence on Jeff to go into his instrumental thing, I did a lot of work, I thought, Jeff's gonna appreciate that, So I get the copies from Player. I think they sent me 50 copies. So I open it up, and it's a really nice cover, first documentary in print, Steve Rosen, cool. So I open it up, And the first pages are these shots of Jeff with his cars and his guitars at his house in England. I go, well, that's not me. I didn't do that. Who is this guy? Why are these photos in my book? I was livid.
Uh-oh.
The Japanese used to do stuff like that. They would just take stuff, and it doesn't matter that you did it. There were ads in the book, like these weird ads of like these, I don't know what they were for. I mean, I send a copy to Jeff.
You warned him?
Yeah, Jeff, actually the first ones were numbered. Jeff got copy number 1. They numbered like the first copies. I got copy number 2, and Les Paul, who I'd gotten to write an intro for the book, got number 3. Jeff was a huge Les Paul fan.
Okay.
I hear back from management. You scumbag, why did you write this? Jeff never okayed anything. Trying to explain to them, well, I'd still be waiting. Years later, I run into Jeff's official photographer, Robert Knight, and he says, Jeff Beck fucking hates you. He hates you, dude. I go, well, what do you want me to do? It's so close to what happened with Ed, and I'll be quick, and I don't want to give this book away. Back in 85, I was going to write Ed's authorized biography. He signed contracts for me. I began work again on interviewing friends and promoters and musicians he'd played with. I mean, amazing interviews. And again, these interviews are taking place of an era. In other words, they were taking place not long after Ed was playing backyard parties. It's not like this guy was being interviewed 40 years later about promoting a Van Halen show. This is, a guy who promoted a show 7 years earlier. Ed ultimately didn't want the book to come out. The book never came out. So I'm sitting on all of this information. I stopped talking with Ed in 2003. In 2020, I start writing the book. And so the book comes out. In 2003, nothing to do with the book, but Ed kind of parts ways with me, and over a DVD that I did called Van Halen: The Early Years. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it because it's really good.
I was going to say, you worked on a documentary?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
didn't
did
know that. Okay.
Yeah, it was a documentary. And again, there was no participation from Van Halen. We couldn't use their music, of course, but it was really good, man. I've seen it. It's on Tubi, one of the, cable stations. And on YouTube, I guess you can see it as well. There's like 800,000 views. I mean, it's insane. So be careful what you wish for, man. Best laid plans. I mean, I would have cut off a finger for Ed. I would have done anything for Jeff Beck. And you spend your time writing these books, doing what you think is something positive and, enhancing their legacy in some tiny way. Not that Edward Van Halen or Jeff Beck needs me to write books about them for people to love them. But, it's just a strange thing, man. It's like I'd written books about them that completely insulted them, like Jeff sucks. And, so anyway, weird stuff, man.
Now, when you first kind of wrote your first couple books, how do you approach it? Even just getting out to the masses, getting it published, getting it, distributed. That seems like a lot of work. Obviously, with the Japanese, your first book, the Japanese company probably handled everything.
Yeah.
But maybe let's go to your second or third. How did you get the connection just to get it distributed? How did you get the rights to use people's names? And how do you physically, like from a legality standpoint, how do you do a book? How do you put out a book?
Yeah, man. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And back in the day, somehow it just seemed, I don't know, easier. So, like I said, I think that second book that I did, and I think I got off course here a little bit. I think it was a book on Free and Bad Company. So I must have heard about a company called SAF Books in England. And this is the computer days by then. So I must have, maybe sent them a letter. Hi, my name is Steve Rosen, and I wrote a book on Jeff Beck, and I've written for Guitar Player and all these magazines, and I had these amazing interviews with Free and Bad Company. You want a book? Sure, we want a book. I never went and asked the artists. Legally, you don't need to do that, but I wanted their participation. So I did reach out to Paul Rogers and Simon. I wanted their input. I wanted to do more interviews, and they remember me from the Bad Company Rolling Stone story. And they gave me a lot of great stuff. I wrote a book on Ozzy, and a company called Sanctuary Publishing printed it. I don't know how I got in contact with them. But that actually went into a third printing. I think it sold about 5,000 copies, which is really good for a rock and roll biography. And Ozzy wrote the foreword. It was unbelievable. I ended up doing a book on Prince and Springsteen. Those are the only two. Well, I take that back. But they were two of the artists that I never interviewed. And I was reluctant to do those books because, guys who do books on people they've never interviewed. Look, there have been some good books written. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's like, you're really going to write a book about someone you've never interviewed. It's like, even if the interview's a half hour, you don't have that connection somehow. That's just me, but I was approached by this company. I forget, another English company. They said, hey, write both books, we'll pay you to do both books. I go, okay. And again, I put together what I thought were pretty good books. Look, I never interviewed them. I wasn't going to get an interview with Prince or Bruce Springsteen, but I interviewed guitar players who played on their records. I interviewed Prince's engineer, and they were good books. I had some really, really good tab that I had a buddy of mine put together. They weren't the greatest books, but they were good. I wrote a book on Randy Rhoads. I never interviewed Randy, but the person who approached me, Andrew Klein, he had sort of done like a rough
draft of it or something.
A rough draft. And he says, hey man, can you put this together? So I kind of put that together for him, and I had done interviews with Ozzy and some other people, and I kind of wrote that, and he really loved the book, and it came out really good. Unfortunately, the Rhoads family shut it down, which was a shame, because had they signed on, the book could have really done really well.
Oh yeah.
It was a oversized coffee table book. Was really great. But in answer to your question, man, it was just different. You could reach out to publishers, and if they didn't want it, at least they'd respond to you. Now, to get any kind of a book like that printed, with any kind of a publisher, you need an agent. No agent is going to respond to you unless you've written books. You can't write a book until you have an agent. I have a really bad taste in my mouth for agents. I'll be real quick. I thought, I'm going to approach an agent with the story of a lifetime. This journalist was friends or had a relationship with Edward Van Halen, the greatest guitar player in the world, for 26 years. No other writer has that story. He hung out with Ed. He jammed with Ed. He got high with Ed. My God, I thought agents would fall over themselves. I never heard back from one single agent, and I must have sent out a dozen, not even a form letter. Hey, if we like it, we'll get back to you. Never went any further. One agent said, hey, send me a chapter. I sent him a sample chapter, and that was it. So yeah, man, it's tough. Look, I understand there's got to be a degree, a dividing line, but those same agents I could have approached 30 years ago, man, and they probably would have responded to me. Look, they may have hated the book, but at least I would have gotten, hey, sorry. Again, the internet has made everything so inaccessible in so many ways. It's been both a boon and a curse. And for me as a writer, in terms of access to information, my God, some of these metal bands, I didn't know who these bands were. I'd probably heard of them, but I didn't know who their, I didn't really know or what the music was, So in that respect, it was amazing. In respect of, accessibility to a lot of things, it's impossible. So yeah, man.
What has been your favorite form of art that you've done in your life? Has it been, from a journalist perspective, has it been, the articles, that you were writing in Rolling Stone, or has it been the books, or was it doing the documentary? What has been kind of your favorite thing just to do?
Yeah.
Well, let me chime in for Steve. I'm gonna talk for Steve real quick. No, but he had mentioned in the book that he was jamming with Eddie, and they were kind of coming up with a song together, right?
Yeah, I kind of had like a basic of a song.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in the book it's kind of one of your big heartbreaks. I hate to bring that up, but I feel like that's something that is. Could you go into that a little more? I apologize for not really getting into it, but it seems like you had something there.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, in answer to your question too, Tanner, that ties in, DJ.
Yeah.
So I'm there with my buddy Ron De La Vega, a really, really good musician, plays keyboards. His first instrument is the bass, but he plays cello. I actually write a story in a chapter in the book. Ron came up to Edward's house, and because Ed wanted to learn cello, and that's a story you will not believe. It's an amazing story. So I'm there with Ron, and we're working on a song I had. I was writing songs, but Ron was like, he was also like the tech guy. I mean, I couldn't run a 4-track if my life depended on it, man. I could honestly, man, the social media thing, Facebook and Instagram, I do not know how to respond to messages. I never know where they're going. So the idea of running a 4-track, man, how to bounce tracks. Oh my God. Thank goodness for Ron. So we're there and he's playing keyboards and I'm playing guitar and we're working on a song I had called Mortal Man. And it was a pretty good song. So we're there and there's a knock at my door. This is when I'm up on Weepaw Way, 1909. Edward literally lives 10 minutes away, up on Mulholland, over on Coldwater Canyon. I was knocking the door and it's Ed. And he just came over. And, hey man, what are you doing? And he sees the gear, and it's like,
you're recording.
We're recording.
And Eddie Van Halen walks in.
My first thought is, my God, it's like,
he's gonna laugh at you or something.
Yeah, exactly. Or he's gonna hear it. Or how do I do this? How do you,
I get that.
How do you?
That's crazy.
How do you play guitar in front?
No, exactly.
So he sits down and we're playing the track and he goes, oh, that sounds pretty cool, man. Let me have your guitar. So I give him the guitar, and he starts playing. And I'm sitting there and Ron's recording, and Ed has never heard the song. The changes are pretty simple. Ed hears it instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, oh, well, man, I tried this. And his input, his sense of orchestration and his sense of harmony, it's like we think of him as this remarkable guitar player, and he is. He put in his 10,000 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But, maybe sometimes it's overlooked on how brilliant he was as an orchestrator and laying parts over parts and weaving parts together and his changes and going in and out of keys. And he did these things and his accents and the way, it goes, well, man, and he characterized my playing was like, really, it was like really clean. It was like Andy Summers, kind of really clean, and he kind of, tweaked something, and he's kind of punching it, and hitting these accents. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I couldn't have thought of that in a million years. And it's like instant to him, and he's into it. And I say to him at one point, because I think, well, maybe he's like, he plays music all day. Does he want to be doing this? And I go, Ed, I'm kind of sorry. He goes, yeah. He goes, right. Like I don't like music.
Right.
He was having a better time than we were. Not really, but that's how much he loved music. So he ends up playing like this solo and these parts over the song. That was one time. I'm over at his house. This is actually another song. He says, hey man, let's jam. So he picks up the bass. We're in 5150. I pick up his guitar and I'm thinking, Rosen, play something. And I play this little riff that I've been working on, simple little thing, but it was cool, and he goes, oh, what's that? And he starts playing like these bass parts we're playing, for like a half hour, 45 minutes. He records everything. He gives me the cassette. That little gesture in and of itself, because he knew what it meant for me to be jamming with him, not in any ego sense, but he just knew, and he would never verbalize it like saying, "Oh, I bet you want this," or "Oh, aren't you?" He never said that, because it would have been too humiliating.
Right,
It would have been,
right.
He just never did that. So he drove me home, and I don't know why. Either my car was in the shop, so again, I live 10 minutes away. So we're driving, and he goes, "Oh, so what are you going to do with that song?" And I'm thinking, I don't know, man. He says, "Well, do you think I could work on it some more?" And I go, "Ed, of course you can do anything you want." So for the next couple of days, and that's what DJ references as heartbreaking, I'm thinking, my God, he's going to work it into a song that's going to, or the riff is going to end up on a Van Halen record, or it's going to be a song co-written by Steve Rosen and Edward Van Halen. And you want to talk about, as an art thing, what meant to me as much as anything, that moment meant as much to me as anything. I did a thing called Highway Sentinels pretty recently. A guy called David Reese was a singer. He was a singer for Accept, not the original singer. A drummer was a guy called Mark Zonder. Mark played in Fate's Warning.
Tons of bands, tons. Yes, one of the best prog drummers ever.
Really?
Yes,
Unbelievable.
Yes.
Wow.
I had reached out to some of not my buddies, guys I interviewed over the years. I got Joe Satriani to play a solo. Tracy Guns, Paul Gilbert, Bumblefoot. I was really proud. These are songs I had written. Man, and answer your question, I guess would I have traded everything I did as a journalist to have been in a rock and roll band? I don't know, man. I suppose if that band had some success, if we had never done anything, would I have done that? I don't think so. But man, writing a book is it's like 1,000 times harder than an article, not just because of the length, but because you have to be creative for 200 pages, where an article, hey,
It's
man,
like
if I can,
600 pages.
What's that?
I said it's like 600 pages.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, man, writing a book, there's something real about it, but there's some stories that I've written that I was really proud of,
Yeah.
because they've resonated with so many people for so many years. A Jimmy Page cover that I did in 77 for Guitar Player. I was out on the road. Oh, Zeppelin I was out with for 11 days. That story, I get so many people said, "Man, I never knew anything about Jimmy Page, and your story was like the Bible for me." That to me is like the greatest compliment, because it's like, I'm a part of this person's life. That issue maybe resides on their shelves somewhere, So yeah, man, those were important stepping stones for me.
I want to get back to a point here, and we'll get to Tonechaser. I promise, DJ. You'll be able to talk. I promise. I just wanted to learn more about who Steve Rosen is for people who, I'm sure that all you do all you have done is talked about the book, with other interviews. So this is a little different kind of format. You just have to roll with it.
It's all good, man. I love this stuff.
Okay, so when you were first starting, who were some of the journalists that you kind of were writing like? Because it's like being a musician. It's like being anything when it comes in art. You try and emulate your heroes. So I'm generally curious for you specifically in the journalism realm, because I know nothing about who the greats were in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Who were you trying to emulate?
That's a great question, man. I touched on her name earlier, Jacoba Atlas, writing for Melody Maker. It was just so good. It was like everything I wanted to be. I loved those English weekly newspapers, Melody Maker, Enemy, and Sounds. And I did want to mention, you talk about these landmarks in my career. 73, I go to England with my buddy. my high school buddy, and we hitchhike around. Excuse me, Europe. You know, do the backpack thing, man. Sleep in the fields in Italy, man. It was great. It was, excuse me, it was unbelievable. Mark Yandell was the music editor for the LA Star, that softcore porn newspaper that printed my first 2 stories. He had names of the editor for sounds. How he got that, Billy Walker. And he had names for Joe Cocker's manager.
Oh, wow.
He had the name of Paul McCartney's manager. This is Wings. This is right after the Beatles breakup. So I have all these names. And I want to keep your question in mind about writers that influenced me, but this ties into it. So I'm there. I'm reaching out to these people. I reach out to Billy Walker, the editor for sounds. I go to the offices for sounds. This is like walking into, dude, I can't even, this is like walking into the greatest. I mean, I never in a million years could have imagined. I was reading sounds, and those articles by those writers is the point I'm trying to make. For something about English journalism, God, the writers for sounds. Nick Kent was one of these guys. Jerry Gilbert was an astounding writer. There was something about the English writing. For Creem, and I got a rejection letter from him. Famous guy. Actually, he's in Almost Famous.
Oh, you're talking about who John Philip Seymour Hoffman played? What was it? Lester Bangs.
Lester Bangs. Yeah, you know, it's strange. I read these people, and I read books by authors I love. Obviously, we all do. You know, John Steinbeck, I think, is the greatest who ever lived. And I read John Steinbeck books, but more contemporary. You know, I read T.C. Boyle books. You know, and Tom Robbins and Harry Cruz and so many others. And it's like part of me, I sit there and I go, this is just the greatest writing I've ever read, you know. The other part of me thinks I am never going to read another one of their books. I am never going to be that good. And I've always carried that with me, you know. So when I write this book, it's like, I think, how would Tom Robbins have approached that? And Tom Robbins does a thing. Look, I don't want anybody to think that, oh, this Rosen thinks he's Tom Robbins. Never in a million years. But Tom Robbins has a style of writing. He does that alliteration thing, like Silver Surfer seeks, you know, he does it, you know, so I will do that, you know, and that's a Tom Robbins thing. And I think, how would they frame this, you know, and it's never going to come out like that. But in answer to your question, I was reading a lot of those people, a lot of that English press, man, those melody maker writers. Last point. So I'm there at Tony Brainsby. Tony Brainsby was managing McCartney and Wings. He says, hey, man, you want to go see McCartney and Wings up in Birmingham? I'm in London. He goes, yeah, and afterwards there's going to be a press conference. You want to go? I go, no, Tony, I don't want to go to a press conference with Paul McCartney. So I'm up there, and it's in a room. Barbara Sharon. Barbara has written several books, an amazing writer. Pete. I'm sorry. It's on the tip of my tongue. I'm in a room with all these writers from Melody Maker and Sounds and NME. This is 73. I've written for the LA Star. I'm nobody, which is the other amazing thing, is that all these publicists have opened their doors to this unknown writer from the, sure, man, you want to interview Joe Cocker? First interview I ever did.
Joe Cocker, right?
Joe Cocker.
Yeah.
And I record over the interview, over the cassette, because I think I'm never going to do another interview again. I can't afford another 25 cents for a dude. Just shoot me. But you know, you talk about, it was just a different time and meeting people. It was just, it was just different, you know. And answer your question, a lot of English press. I mean, Cameron, I mean, God, you know, some of his work.
Now, one writer that I have not heard his name yet is Hunter S. Thompson, and
Oh my
and
God.
I'm curious, how did you separate the party aspect from doing your job and retaining all the information to write your article? It's like, how do you, back in those times? I mean, how do you separate the
Yeah.
party from the work?
Yeah, man. Well, I'll tell you, man, I read Hunter and I wanted to become a drug addict. Dude, I wanted to do coke and drink all day if it would make me write like that. Obviously, no one's going to write like Hunter. I was never that kind of a personality. I couldn't drink. I hated the taste of alcohol, and I was susceptible to migraines. And if I looked at a beer, if I had a sip of a glass of wine or a gin tonic, if the idea that I might get a migraine from it, I just couldn't do it. I think I smoked pot once or twice, and I write about smoking pot. And I talk about drinking with Ed a little in the book, and we did coke. I did coke later, but I don't think I ever got high when I was going to do an interview for that exact reason. I thought, my God, man, I'm writing the story. I got to concentrate. That's hard enough. Even if I smoked a joint or something, I get home, it's like babble. So I was always able to keep that separate. But yeah, man, when I read Hunter, I thought, oh my God, he's the greatest. For him to shoot himself at the end of the day, man, we can all suppose why he did that. I mean, his last few books, did he himself think he didn't measure up? I don't know, but my God, his body of work was unbelievable. And I met him once. Well, briefly, he was signing books at Book Soup. So I actually got there early with my brother, and he walked by and he said hello. I go, "Doctor, how are you?" But I had actually tried to reach out and try to interview him because he was into music. He liked weird stuff. He was actually a Jimmy Buffett fan who just passed away, and he was also Lyle Lovett. I think he co-wrote a lyric with Lyle Lovett. So obviously I don't think he was going to be like a big rock and roll guy, but I thought, my God, can you imagine sitting down and talking about music with Hunter? Oh my God. And then I was up in Aspen. A friend had a house up there, and I drove by, Olive Farm a couple times where he lived. But what a tragedy.
So let's go to Tonechaser.
Yeah.
And obviously, you've had a long history with Eddie Van Halen. I'm sure it's detailed in the book. I need to read the book so that when you come back on again, I can actually ask you in-depth questions on the book.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let DJ kind of take over this realm.
Yeah.
But start with your reasonings for wanting to do this in 2020 compared to 2003.
That's a good question. So again, without giving the ending away to those who haven't read it, and everybody listening should have read it by now, so get your copy. Yeah. I'm kidding. Excuse me. So 2003, the relationship ends. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Honestly, for several years, I was pretty mad. Hurt. I was embarrassed. What did I do? What happened? Then you look back and you think, were you really that close to this guy? Did you know him that well? I suppose it's the same questions you ask about in relationship. It could be a girlfriend, or marriage. Did what we have, is that what I thought it was? Is that what it, is that what I thought? So years go by. I'm sorry, man. Can I take a quick break?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can we? Is it okay?
Yeah, we're good, man. We're live right now, so we'll continue talking. And
might you have a bottle of water?
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
no,
man.
you're good, man. You're good. All right. Ask.
You want me to keep talking?
Yeah. Just for a second. I'll help you out.
Well, one of the first things I thought was really interesting, maybe this is known and maybe I just didn't know it, but Van Halen they were originally lying about their ages.
Yeah.
That they were a couple years, I think, they said they were older than they were.
They said they were
Or they're
younger.
younger.
than they were.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because it would be more compelling selling point.
Exactly.
It's like even Eddie Van Halen had to find a way to be more to differentiate himself.
Exactly.
Like just every angle possibly.
Exactly.
Like they couldn't possibly fail. Like
Exactly.
everything was covered. I also thought that, I mean, you said in the book about Eddie, you know, and yeah, the friendship, I guess, ended, the relationship, but in the book, you know, it's not like a hit piece by any means. Like you love the guy, and you said about Eddie, he's forever seeking out ways to make a guitar do what it had never done before, but more than that, it was recrafting, redesigning, and reconfiguring an instrument to serve his own needs and requirements. And after you had said that, later on, you talked about a story about Eddie trying to craft a new type of guitar. So he was talking about like the trays at like hotels, the room service trays, and how this keyboard was going to pop out of the guitar somehow. Like, this is beyond me, but it was like Eddie not only probably did the 10,000 hours of playing and listening, but he probably did 10,000 hours of like building guitars too. Like, that was the next level, which is fascinating to me.
Well,
Absolutely.
Eddie Van Halen and Dick Dale kind of share like a similar trajectory as far as reinventing music in general.
Okay.
Dick Dale, obviously, with the amplifier, you know,
Yeah.
Because he literally would blow out every amplifier he'd play. So I think Marshall or something built gosh darn it, help me out here.
For Dick Dale?
Yeah.
Fender?
Yeah, the twin, I think
Twin reverb.
Yeah, the twin reverb
Yeah.
form. And with Ed,
Ask him, he knows.
well, that's why I'm trying. Yeah, I'm trying to add
Yeah.
more context to
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah, that's cool.
No, I appreciate
But yeah, Ed was reinventing like the guitar. Just he was literally drilling holes in his guitar.
Yeah, no,
Frankenstein
that's,
is
I didn't
literally
realize. And
yeah.
I think Steve had asked him about like, how do you even like string your guitar? And it was like, he didn't really want to say too much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah. And I write, again, maybe not that it's overlooked, but again, we think of Ed as this
The player part.
guitar
It's
player.
a different.
You don't think of him as much as a guitar builder, a
Mhm.
luthier.
Right.
I mean, you know, he built his first guitar, took a body, a second, and a neck, $125, and put it together. Got a pickup and
That's
put
crazy.
the pickup in. And with Eddie, I go, Ed, how do you do this? And he's, oh, well, it's not that hard.
Yeah.
Try to put a guitar together.
Yeah, no thanks.
I mean, just try
It's
to
like
put
building
a
an
neck.
engine. You know, it's like those people they could probably build it in their brain first.
Yeah.
They could test it in their brain, and you could probably hear how it was going to sound before even building it. Like that's
Well, that's something.
masterful.
That's something I always thought about. Was you hearing that sound? What Ed described as a brown sound, which I always took to be this very organic, uncluttered, you know, processed sound. Did he hear that sound in his head and build a guitar to fill that sound, or did he build a guitar, hear the sound, and then he said that's it? I think it was a little bit of both. And you think about the guitar players who have actually built guitars and played those guitars, and the only two people I can think of was Les Paul and Brian May.
Oh, okay.
Right? I'm not talking about Slash, you know, playing a Les Paul and bringing new life into the Les Paul with Guns N' Roses, and maybe you know, putting a different pickup in there, and then there's a Slash model by Gibson. You know, there's a lot of those guitars out, and those are all legitimate, but Slash never built his own guitar from scratch. Took a neck and a body and put them together, found pickups, rewired pickups.
Amazing.
My God,
Yeah.
It's
And that's what I didn't realize just as the casual fan, and I'm not a guitar guy, but I was like, wow, that's pretty insane. You know what, Steve, recently I was just scrolling on Instagram. I know that's not your favorite, but I noticed that and you've also said that you don't listen to the heavier type of stuff, or covered it. Maybe I'm kind of lying a little bit here, but I saw that Gary Holt of Exodus
Oh, yeah.
and of Slayer recently got your book and posted about it, and he's going to read it. I just thought that's fascinating. And how is that relationship with you and Exodus or with Gary Holt? Because Gary Holt, well, I mean, he was in Slayer. I mean, he took over for Jeff Hayman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not nobody.
No, absolutely. And one, I never expected Gary to.
I'm a huge fan, by the way, of Exodus. I love the band. Met him a couple times, but
as those types of bands go, Exodus were really good.
Yeah.
Look, Gary Holt is a really good guitar player. And I mentioned before, a lot of these bands have amazing guitar players. Would I sit down and listen to Exodus records all day? No. Would I listen to Slayer records all day? No. But I can recognize really good guitar players. And what I thought was so amazing is, yes, you see Gary Holt.
And he said that he's always chasing tone. That was also
exactly
another part.
I love that.
That was cool.
And so when I heard back from him, I thought, this is so great, because I love that idea of mixing and matching. Gary Holt, I thought he has to be a Van Halen fan, even though what he's doing musically, or certainly he's aware of him.
Yeah.
So to have Gary, if he wanted to read the book and then talk about it, that to me is amazing. So yeah, I've reached out to a ton of heavy guys. Again, I wish I could think of some of these guys.
Well, with these guys too, I mean, it's funny. You can go to death metal guys, black metal, and you bring up Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen as a guitar player, and like maybe they're like, you know what, I'm not my favorite, but he is a great guitar. Like every person recognizes it's great. Exactly. He's a great musician.
One point I want to touch on with Ed and how he influenced me differently than a guitar from a guitar player standpoint was he was literally not afraid to like do his own thing. Like he literally added keyboards in a
he writes about this. He asks, sorry to cut you off, but he asks Eddie like, hey, do you guys take chances? And he goes, yeah, me, Eddie, and Alex take chances. David Lee Roth, no.
Well, I mean,
that was fascinating. Nothing against him, but
what I appreciated about Ed and his influence was he was just not afraid of doing things. Like literally the 80s, in my opinion, the hair metal scene, without Van Halen, there is no.
Oh,
literally all the 80s hair metal bands, to me personally, are all like trying to be Van Halen. So that's just my opinion. It's just my opinion here. I'm sure it'll piss off a lot of people, but that's just, I mean, nobody is Van Halen.
Yeah. And what I learned about Steve's book too, and probably everyone already knows this, but hey, it took for me reading this book to learn is that Van Halen had been together for 4 years.
Well,
and these bands they were with had 4 albums in 4 years. So it was like they were the new kids on the block, but they're like, hey, we're not really, because we've been around, like that we're tight because we've been together 4 years, not just because we don't have these albums. And then I think you also mentioned, I forgot who said this to Eddie, but they're like, don't give out our demos, because someone, it might have been, who was it, Quiet Riot or Rat or someone that tried to rip off You Really Got Me.
No, that was Angel.
Oh, Angel. Okay.
We tried to rip off Van Halen.
That's right.
They were going to come out
right before the album came out. They tried to redo it or something.
Wow. So
there's a lot of competition, but that was interesting.
But yeah, just my point was he was doing things at a time when like a lot of people literally copied Van Halen and they couldn't replicate it. And just again, when you got to think like 83, 84, when Jump came out, I'm just only specifically talking keyboards here.
Right.
Not many bands that were of that ilk or on that level were doing that. And I was told that he was influenced from Crash and Burn, the Pat Travers record, because Pat Travers was doing keyboards in that specific album. I've heard he was listening to that as he was writing Jump, which would be really cool if that actually was true. I don't know. I wasn't there, but just the fact that of like a heavy guy at his peak, reached a whole other level with just trying something new that everyone else was afraid of doing.
Go through new boundaries.
Should tell you everything you need to know about why Eddie Van Halen was great. Forget the guitar playing aspect, just from a musical standpoint. that's what I get from Eddie Van Halen that most people don't even recognize. It's just all about the guitars. But I always like, from a songwriter's perspective, for trying new things, like he reached he's another level for me.
Yeah.
That's why Eddie Van Halen's great for me personally. So
he's an icon for sure. Bringing keyboards in.
I'm just saying, trying new things at a time when like everybody was afraid, because everybody wanted this to just be Van Halen 1, and
right,
that had already been done.
Right. So that first record comes out in '78, man. It's all punk bands.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you had heavier acts. I would argue that, Mahogany Rush was heavy for its time. You had bands of that ilk, Zeppelin and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Montrose, 70, 73, 74.
You even had Judas Priest.
That's true. That is true.
Iron Maiden was kind of around-ish.
Iron Maiden wasn't until 79,
79.
But Priest was
there.
73, 74, but they weren't as heavy as what Van Halen 1.
No, that's true.
So Van Halen 1,
that's fair.
It's been well documented. That's kind of why I don't like talking about Van Halen 1, is because it's already been documented on how it changed the landscape of music in general. It literally defined the 1980s was Van Halen 1.
Yep.
And the Sunset Strip. So my point is what has been the aspect of Ed that you learned the most, maybe from writing this book? That, I mean, you knew him for so long, but was there an aspect of Ed's life or his career or his musical palette that you learned where it was like, man, I never knew that, and then when writing this book, it kind of brought that out for you?
Those are the kinds of things I wish I could have gotten into more with him. I mean, we only just started touching on his influences, and I write about this a chapter. I don't think Ed's the scope of his musical knowledge was that expansive. I think Ed had bands that he kind of listened to, but even within that, I mean, I don't know if I could be entirely wrong here. I don't know if Ed knew where Clapton came from. I mean, I think Ed certainly knew that Clapton was in John Mayall before the Yardbirds and before Creem, but I don't know if Ed knew that Clapton's early bands. I mean, the Roosters. I mean, I'm being hardcore here, but he probably knew Blonde. Yeah.
It was a little later. But
Exactly. But I don't know if he knew that Jimmy Page was a studio musician. I would love to have talked to him about that. But then he would bring up bands like Stray Dog. I go, oh, wow. In fact, I just got Snuffy Walden, the guitarist for Stray Dog, who's an unbelievable guitar player, to take a photo with the book. And I think he put the book up on his social media. So he mentioned Stray Dog. Oh, that's weird. Then he said to me, yeah, man, we're doing a song by Spirit. But it's funny because he said to me, like, I didn't know who Spirit was. I think Spirit is one of the greatest bands ever. Randy California is one of the greatest unsung. But, I think they did like a James Brown song. So he kind of had a little bit of a knowledge. But he was into UK, the prog band, Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth, who was one of his guys. But I don't know if he knew about other UK bands, Colosseum or Soft Machine. I mean, he probably knew Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis, obviously Genesis. But so I'm not sure how much he knew. So in answer to your question, did I learn something about him that I didn't know? I really think I learned more about Ed. It was more of his character and him being an extraordinarily modest human being. He knew who he was. He knew how good he was. I never ever heard him say, man, I can blow that guy away. Man, that guy's solo sucks. He might put somebody down. He might, talk about somebody, but it was always more in a musical sense. It was never like, oh, I'm so much better than him, or my solo was so great. We were talking when you were gone. DJ was bringing up how Ed made believe that he was 2 years younger than he was. He and Alex.
Yeah.
So when they were 24, they said they were 22, as if being 22
Made some
his
huge difference.
his talent was somehow bigger.
Yeah.
I mean, who would do that other than somebody who was a little
Well,
bit insecure
you know
about
what
being
it's-
24?
You know what it's like? I don't know if you're a football fan or a sports fan, but it's like Bill Belichick, the coach of the New
Yeah.
England Patriots, who goes and like illegally tapes like the last place team and then gets in trouble for it. But it's like when you're that good, you do anything to get an extra edge. It's so weird
Yeah,
though, but
yeah.
it's like the greatest of all time. Like that's the greatest coach of all time. This
Yeah.
is one of the greatest guitarists of all time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like they do these little things that
Yeah.
seem silly to us, but to them, like they got to do it.
Yeah.
So that what makes them great.
Yeah.
Saying
so,
you're 2 years younger is just,
yeah.
that,
So that
that's
was
it.
part of it. His absolute reverence of music. I
Hmm.
mean, he was a guy who 24 hours a day, that's what he did. I don't think there are many people like that on the planet. I mean, even the great guitar
Yeah.
players, I mean, before family, I hate to say that, not all the time, but before everything, it was Ed and his guitar. I mean, it was learning that side about him more than the actual musical something that he would said. I mean, I wish I could have gotten into that. I mean, there's 1,000 questions. Real quick. So Ed's over at the house one time, like I told you about my huge record collection, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to turn Ed onto some records. So we go into my bedroom, and the records are on every wall. I mean, stacked, and so I started pulling out records. There was some Steely Dan records. I think I gave him some of those prog records, maybe some Soft Machine. I think I gave him some records by some Les Paul records. I think I like Larry Carlton. I thought those kinds of guitar players he'd get off on. Just a ton of records, and I gave them to him, and never heard another word. I'm pretty positive he never listened to a record, and he never gave them back. Look, I'm kidding. I can't keep my records, but that's just the way he was. Ed he had no desire or didn't need to hear Larry Carlton. Though I thought it, could have been interesting. Maybe it's the same way me here, reading other writers. It's like, my God, I'm never, I can't write like that. I don't want to read those writers. They're too good. I don't know if Ed thought that way, but it was more of him as a human being as opposed to, the musician side, really kind of the modesty thing, just no ego.
Seemed like the one knock you had on him was it's not what I'm about to describe, but like you would listen to Van Halen records with him, I think, before anyone else, or like maybe it was demos or it was
a rough track.
Okay,
Yeah.
but you did mention that during those times he would be smoking cigarettes, and that like your one knock on him is that you just said you wished he didn't chain smoke the cigarettes. I thought that was kind of interesting.
He was a horrible smoker. I had another friend. I'll say it's no big deal. Donnie Jones, also a very talented guy, great guitar player, who smoked as much as anybody I'd ever seen. Ed smoked more than Donnie. I mean, it was horrible. And I'd mentioned that I was susceptible to migraines, cigarette smoke. Oh my
Probably
God.
didn't do you any favors.
Oh God. And that's why, back in the day, there was no smoking bans. So, every club, every restaurant, on airplanes.
It's destroyed you.
Oh my God. And I used to get migraines and they were horrible. So, and I even write about, later on, it's not the drugs or, the drinking, it isn't going to get Ed. It's going to be the smoking, and the smoking got him.
Like, geez.
So what was, for you, DJ, what was one point that you took away from this book that you had, I don't know how much research you've ever done on Eddie Van Halen.
Right,
But
no.
what did you learn mostly about Eddie Van Halen
I mean,
through Steve's work?
He was a human. And I think kind of like when you read the book, it does go through a trajectory, kind of explaining like how Steve met, kind of where, you know, Eddie was at, you know, in 78, Eddie Van Halen was still living with his parents. So, and then you get towards the end of the book, you know, it labeled, it was like in chapter 62, it's called The Day the Music Cried. And you have, you know, Eddie Van Halen's in, doing, you know, has joint custody of Wolfie with Val. He's getting sued by David Lee Roth for $1.2 million. So it's like, gosh, that's no matter, you know, and I think Steve called him, you know, Godhead, because that's what you would call guitarists that you just know are, you know, beyond your average person or whatever, you know, but he's still a human. Like he still had to battle things that normal people. You still got to be a good husband, a good father.
Yep.
So I think just knowing he was a human being, I'm even more interested now about him because I read the book. I'm thankful for Steve giving me the book to read and check out. It's written very well. I feel like my grammar has gotten a little better. Steve is a very good writer, and he provides a lot of context. Yeah, like I wish I knew more about guitars. I was a drummer. But like as a guitarist, like you would find a lot of information maybe you don't already know, but it's very interesting stuff.
I hope to learn more about his songwriting, because everybody knows about his guitar playing, but I was more influenced by Ed's, how he wrote songs. That's super like underrated with Eddie Van Halen. So Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and hanging with us. We generally appreciate it. We hope to do it again soon with you. We're technically neighbors now, so you're welcome on the show anytime.
Positively.
But where can people find the book and support you? And also, what is the next book that you're writing? What is the next venture that you want to get into? If not a book, is it more documentaries? Is it going to be a movie this time? Is it?
Well, Tanner, maybe you guys work together and maybe do a documentary or something. Tanner's got this documentary going.
We'll talk off the air,
well,
but I want to focus my attention on Steve. Yeah, give us all the information just in terms of how people can support you.
So you can find Tonechaser on my website. The address there is tonechaserbook.com, and you're looking at the cover of the second edition. The first edition sold out, and thank you to everybody who supported that. That was unbelievable. Going into a second edition is, talk about one of those moments, man. That was one. When that last book, goes out the door.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. That's awesome.
It's unbelievable.
Wow.
So tonechaserbook.com. You can also find Tonechaser on Amazon, eBay, Reverb, and Etsy. If anybody goes to Etsy, I figured, hey, put it up on Etsy. Somebody's going to buy a handmade purse and they'll go check out my Van Halen book, I also wanted to tell everybody that I just started a little contest.
Ooh.
So this has to do with having you write a review on Amazon. So Amazon loves reviews, and to be honest, so do I. People have written such amazing things to me. I keep thinking, my God, I wish they'd written that for Amazon, So if you go to my Facebook page, I think if you type in Tonechaser Steve Rosen, you could find it and all the information. Basically, if you just write a review and go post it on Amazon, and let me know that you posted it. The best reviews, I'll send you a signed copy. And I had these other little Tonechaser mementos made. I don't want to tell you what it is because they're pretty cool little things.
Yeah.
And I'll give those to the runners up, but I'd really appreciate that. And man. So to everybody who's read the book and digs it, thank you so much. And for those who haven't read the book, if you want to find out about Edward Van Halen, I think you should check it out.
Well, Steve, we appreciate you, man.
Thank you, Tanner. It was Great, man.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you
Absolutely.
finally
Buddy,
too.
DJ.
Man. Heard so much about you. So for
Pleasure.
another episode of Popper's Corner, please make sure to go pick up Tonechaser from the great Steve Rosen, and we'll check in with you guys on the next episode. But Steve, thank you very much, and Mr. DJ,
Thanks,
Gunderson,
guys.
thanks so much.
Heck yeah.